Okay, so in this demo, I'm going to guide you guys through doing a daylight setup for a room similar to the environment that you're building for this first project. So the first thing I'm going to do is go to um, the public drive and PC server, intro to modeling, reference, and this is the folder I want to use: Maya, Arnold Indoor Lighting, and AI Standard Surface. I'm going to go ahead and copy that guide to my desktop. Okay, and then inside that folder I have this file, daylight setup begin. That's what we want to use. Now, of course, you're going to be able to do this with your own scene, but for this demo, I just want to work with a known scene that has everything kind of controlled so that you can get through the entire setup and then you can do it again with your scene file. So I'm going to come in here and open up that scene file. And the first problem I have here is that my camera keeps basically getting clipped. It's like coming in and outside of the room, which is a bit of a problem. Whenever we're rendering images in tight spaces, it's a good idea for us to use a camera that has a wider field of view so that we can see more of the room inside. So the way I'm going to fix that is by going to View, select Camera. I'm going to select my camera. I'm going to come over here to the channel box, and I'm going to look for the focal length setting right here, which is under perspective shape. And I want to set this to somewhere between a 12 and an 18. So 12 and 18 millimeter lens. That's kind of a fisheye or a wide angle lens, which is a decent lens for shooting like a tight interior environment. The 12 was working pretty well, so I'm going to go to 12 on the focal length. The next thing I can do here is, if I want to see exactly what I'm going to render, I can turn on the render safe frame, and it'll show me exactly what my camera is going to take a picture of. Because when that thing is not on, it's hard to tell what is going to be in the frame and what isn't. So it's kind of a composition aid, so you can figure out exactly what's going to be in the frame. The other thing we see in here is a 6-foot man, and the sole purpose of this guy being in the scene is for me to just check my scale for my scene, because when we're doing physical based rendering, which is what we're about to do here in Arnold, we need to make sure that our scene scale is actually physically accurate. So that means scaled to real world coordinates. And this guy here is 6 foot tall in centimeters, and so we just need to make sure that my surrounding environment also matches his scale and proportions. Once that's done, I don't need him anymore, so I don't ever want to see this guy show up in a render. So I'm just going to put him on a layer, and then I'm going to name that layer 6-foot man. And I'm going to hide him so I don't see him anymore. Okay, whenever we're doing physical based rendering, which is pretty much all there is these days, physical based rendering just means that the rendering engine is based on physics. And so for physics to work, we actually have to have the scene to scale, so we've checked that box. And then the next thing we need is we're going to need two forms of light. We're going to first need a direct light source and an indirect light source. Those are kind of the two main ingredients to doing a decent PBR setup. So for the first direct light source, we're going to use the sun. And so in this current scene, we're just going to do a daylight setup without any artificial lights whatsoever. And so to create the sun, I'm actually going to create a light, and I'm going to do a directional light. So directional lights are made to emulate the sun. But the first problem I have is that after I create my directional light, it's very tiny and it's hard to see. So the icon for the directional light tends to get lost, and newbies will tend to like unclick that and then not know that's there, and then they'll create another directional light and another one and another one until finally their outliner, if I come over here to show objects and turn on lights, we'll have like 20 directional lights here. So if we only want to have one directional light in our scene, So what I want to do is select that directional light, and I want to make the icon bigger so that I can see it. So it's tempting to scale the light over here using the directional light attributes and scaling this up, which will make the icon larger, but that will also potentially screw up the light's output settings and screw up the render. So what I want to do is I want to leave the scale here set to 1, because again, if I scale that, I might screw up the lighting. I want to instead go to the attribute editor, and I'm going to come down here and look for the object display tab. So object display in the attribute editor, and I'm going to change the locator scale to 50. And then what that's going to do is it's going to make my light icon much bigger, but it's not actually going to change the scale of the light. So it won't screw up my light output. So a directional light looks like this. It's basically just a bunch of spears pointed in a direction. Directional lights emanate light from infinity to infinity. So there's no fall off in a directional light source. It basically just emanates a single intensity of light from one direction to another. It doesn't matter where the directional light icon is, if it's down below the floor or outside. That doesn't matter, because again, the light source emanates from infinity to infinity. So the only thing that matters about a directional light is the direction that it's pointed in. So the first thing I always do is I'm going to point my light in a direction here, and then I need to do a render. So in the past, I've had you guys use the Maya render view, which is fine. It's a decent render view. But you'll notice today that there is also, if I go into the Arnold tab here, there is also an Arnold renderer. So you might be asking, what is the difference between the two? The difference is that the Arnold renderer is much faster and it's less buggy. So it works more reliably with Arnold. And the Maya one can tend to glitch out here and there, as you guys have already found out doing your renders for classes. So I'd like to start using this renderer from this day forward, and I want to talk about a few things. So this renderer is always rendering, and it's always going to render your active camera. So, and if I want to stop it, I have to hit the stop button, and if I want to start it, I have to hit the play button. Once I hit play, it's basically actively rendering, and so if I change my scene view here, you can see that the render view is actually going to try to update. So it's kind of cool, because if you're on a fast computer, this thing updates really quickly, and you can sit here and kind of interactively tweak your materials and your lighting, and it's really pretty awesome when it works. If I want to pause it, I just hit the stop button, and then now it's no longer actively rendering. And when I want to start actively rendering again, I got to hit the play button. Another thing that's really useful, you can see these little cross hatches that are kind of appearing in the frame. Those are render tiles that are basically showing us that the renderer is working. And those are turned on by going to Window and turning on Show Render Tiles. It's very important that you set this up right away, because if you don't, it's hard to tell with Arnold if it's actually doing anything other than your computer is going to go kind of slow. So I strongly recommend, first things first, going into the window here and turning on Show Render Tiles so you can see that the render is actually working. The next thing is that by default, it's rendering at almost full resolution. So what we want to do is we want to work in this fashion. We want to go to View, and we want to set the test resolution in the beginning to 10%. And then what we do is we refine our renders, we incrementally increase this over the course of the rendering project. So what I typically do is in the very beginning, I start at a 10% render, and then what I do is I just zoom the frame up a little bit so you can actually see what you're doing, but the render time will go from a couple minutes all the way down to a couple of seconds. So if I render at 100%, it's going to take forever. You can try that on your own. And then if you switch it to test resolution 10%, it's going to render almost instantly. So the way this works is as we're refining our lighting and our materials and stuff, we're going to creep that up from 10 to 25 to 50 all the way up to 100% for the final render. So the first problem that I have here is I'm actively rendering, but my light source is kind of dim. It's not very bright. So what I want to do is I want to select that directional light. So I have it selected. And I'm going to come over here, and I just want to show you that you can increase the brightness of this light by changing the intensity. And so I could give this thing an intensity of 10. And you can see that I brightened my light source up. The downside to intensity, though, is that on a project and working in physical values, sometimes these values can get as high as into the millions on a project. And that kind of gets confusing. So the better method, rather than using intensity to increase the brightness of your light source, is to actually use the Arnold setting, which I'm going to come down here in the attribute editor and go to the Arnold tab. And under the Arnold tab, I want to use the exposure. Exposure, typically the values are going to range from, say, 0 all the way up to 30, and they kind of won't go beyond that. They'll kind of stay in a lower value, which makes it more intuitive and easier to work with. So I prefer changing the exposure value, and so I'm going to train you to do it that way. So I'm going to change my exposure value to 5, and then I'm going to re-crank this. All right, and it rendered out. It got a little bit brighter. What I'm looking for at this moment is I'm looking for my direct light source from my sun, and I want it to look kind of like a daylight exposure. So I'm pegging this to like 3 p.m. in the afternoon is kind of what I'm going for. All right, so that brightness actually looks pretty good for my direct light source. But we'll notice here that in the room, it's very noisy. So, and it's also still very dark. This is because we're not getting enough bounce light in our room. And in order to get bounce light, we need indirect light source. So for our indirect light source, we're going to use a Arnold light. So I'm going to come over here to the Arnold tab, and I'm going to use a Skydome light. All right, and we've been using these for our test renders all class long. And we can see here that the moment I create my Skydome light, I'm going to go ahead and re-render that. My scene got a lot brighter. If ever I want to save one of these frames to compare it with another frame, they make it really easy in this viewer. All you have to do is click on the little camera icon down here at the lower right hand corner, and it'll create a new snapshot. So like I can make as many of those as I want, and if I don't want one of them, if I want to delete it, all I have to do is select it and hit the delete key, and I can get rid of those too. One thing to be aware of, though, is that when I have one of these frames highlighted, you won't actually see your render updated until you click on the eyeball there, which now it's going to put me in active render view mode. And so you just got to remember that. So like it can be confusing because you'll be like, how come my render's not updating? And it's because you have this picture here selected. If you deselect it, then now you're getting an active render view. Okay, so I have my indirect light source in the scene, but it's currently not bright enough. So what I want to do is I want to select it. So I'm going to select the Skydome light. And the same deal, I don't want to change the intensity. I actually want to use the Arnold tab and change the exposure. So this light actually doesn't have an Arnold tab, but it does have an exposure setting. So we always should go hunting for the exposure. And then I'm going to crank that up. I'm going to take that up to 5. I usually start at like 5, and then I either start cutting it in half if it's too bright, or I start doubling it if it's not bright enough. So we have the brightness looks okay. We have a new problem, and that is the image is very grainy. And part of that is due to the fact that I'm rendering at 10% resolution. So at this point I might be like, okay, I like it, but it's too grainy. I can't tell what's going on. So I'm going to go into view, and I'm going to change the resolution to 25%. And then I'm going to let that render. And we can see that, yeah, it looks better, and I can kind of see what's going on. I like my lighting, but it's still a little bit too grainy. So graininess is a factor of the render settings. And so I want to show you how to fix that. On faster machines, we can crank up the samples kind of higher, but on these machines here at school, which are a little bit slower, a little bit older, we're going to want to go in here and change these sampling settings to kind of a bare minimum. So the sampling settings are located right here under the render settings tab, and then it's under the Arnold tab. These settings control how much noise goes into the image. So my recommendation, we did some playing around with these computers, is that you set them to like 4 and then 3. So 4 for the master camera and 3 for all the lower ones. And that is still a pretty grainy image, but it's not so grainy that you basically can't see what's going on. You can kind of tell what's up. Now when you do your final renders for your final project, you can take these all the way up to 8, and I wouldn't take them any higher than 8. You can just do 8s across the board. Once you do 8s across the board on the sampling, your render times at full resolution, which is 1920 by 1080, are going to probably shoot through the roof to like an hour to 2 hours, depending on the speed of your machine. And that, yes, that's 2 hours for one single frame. That's just the nature of raster rendering. It takes a long time to create kind of like a film-ready image. Okay, so that's the sampling. I'm going to leave those kind of low, though. I did 4 and then 3s at the bottom. The next thing I want to do is I want to start changing the artistic look of this light. So currently I was just working in value, and value was, well, I wanted the sun to kind of be bright like a 3 p.m. scene, and I wanted my indirect light to be similar to a 3 p.m. scene. But I'm working basically in black and white at this point. So once I get my value dialed in, then I want to start tweaking the color a little bit. So you never want to leave your lights at 100% hospital white because it's kind of the most unpleasing light that you can possibly have. So what I've done here is in that folder that I gave you guys, I have given you a couple color temperature cheat sheets. And this one is a very accurate one, which has Kelvin settings. Kelvin is just a unit of light measure. Maya doesn't actually use Kelvin by default. Maya uses RGB. But all you have to do is basically just make your color in the chip of the light be the same color as these colors, and you'll get kind of an accurate light output. And so these are set for, this is the color of a match flame, candle flame, incandescent light bulb, moonlight, horizon, daylight. And you can just kind of go through this and use this as a cheat sheet to kind of get your lighting colors dialed in, and then feel free to change those after the fact. So this one is more of a scientific color chart, and then I have another one in there. Oh, I'm sorry. This is not the scientific one. This is more of an artistic color chart, and then this one is more of a scientific color chart. So you can use those as you wish. Most people like to just use the artistic one because it's a little bit easier to use. And so I'm going to set my sunlight to kind of a horizon daylight, which is kind of this yellowy orange. So I'm going to come over here and grab my direct light source, and I'm going to come up here to the color node, and I'm going to just go in here and go for a yellowy daylight look. And then over here, when it renders, you can see here that I'm starting to get a little bit of yellow coloration on that sunlight that's coming through, and the yellow sunlight that's hitting the walls and on the cabinet there. Okay, so the direct light source doesn't really add that much to the color of the lighting. Where the color of the lighting is going to come through is in the indirect light source. So I'm going to pause this here for a second, and I'm going to show you guys how to set up your indirect light source so that we basically have a sky dome. Okay, so I'm going to select my indirect light source, which is my AI Sky Dome light. And on the color node, instead of using a solid color, I'm actually going to create a render node, and I'm going to use something called a gradient, or Maya calls it a ramp. And the ramp is going to allow me to turn this thing into like a sky dome so I can make it look like there's actually a horizon line outside, and I can use this to colorize my scene. So I'm going to click on Create Render Node, that little checker box, and I'm going to say Create a Ramp. And so I just created a ramp, and now I want to edit the ramp. The way the ramp works is we have these color nodes, which we can set to whatever color we want. So I can set that to red. And I can have as many of these as I want by clicking inside of here, and it'll make a new one. If I don't like a band that I created, I can get rid of it by just clicking on the X here. And so this is how I'm going to set mine up. I'm going to do my ground color as kind of like a deep crimson red. So almost black. And then I'm going to do a horizon color here, And this one I'm going to make a yellowy, almost yellowy white. And then I'm going to put another color behind here. And this one I'm going to make more blue, actually. There we go. And then behind that one, I'm going to make another one. And this one I'm going to go a little bit deeper blue and a little bit darker blue. And then finally, for the final color, I'm going to make this one kind of like a midnight color. This is at the very extent of the heavens. And then what I can do is I can come into Maya and I can change these bands. So right now, my horizon line is kind of below my room. And you can play with these and shift them around. And then once I get it kind of shifted so it's kind of at ground level, now I'm going to go inside the room. And now I can play with these bands to basically bring different effects into my scene. So if I wanted that horizon color to be brighter up there, if I wanted this to be a sunset, I could do a pinker color in here. But I don't want to do that, so I'm going to get rid of that. I want this to be more like a 3 p.m.-ish sun, so I'm going to brighten this up, bring this down. That looks pretty good. I might make this a little bit brighter. Okay, cool. And so now we can see that my horizon color is showing through there. Now I just need to make sure that it's going to show up in my render. So I'm going to go ahead and render it out. And check it out, how much the indirect light source actually colorizes the scene. So we have that dark red on the ground, and you can see that it's kind of tinting the ceiling up here, red. We have the blue, you can see how much blue it's kicking into the room. And so you can play with these values, and what I recommend doing is, if you have a painting you like, or if you have a photograph that you like, and you really like the horizon and the colors, or a frame from a movie, you can actually use that reference image, and I have a few here in the folder that I gave you. You can actually just pull colors right off of that image. So you can pull your horizon color, next color, next color, next color, next color, and you can kind of very quickly colorize a scene without spending a lot of time on it. The reason I like to do this with a gradient in the beginning is because it very quickly allows you to play with color and kind of get a tonal value or a color palette to your lighting that you enjoy very quickly. And then if you like the color palette, then you can refine it later and do more detailed background images. Since you can, in addition to doing ramps here, you can also use photographic images. If you have what's called an equitangular projection or a spherical map, you can actually use an image to drive this instead of the gradient like we're using. Gradients are awesome though, again, because how workable it is. It makes it really quick to change and adjust things and kind of work on various looks without spending a lot of time on it. So this is how I recommend setting it up. And so this is your initial daylight setup. And then from here, we just want to tweak the sunlight. So this is something to note, is that once I added the ramp to this indirect light source, it kind of had the effect of darkening the light off. And that has nothing to do with the light actually getting darker. It just has to do with the pixel values getting darker that it's sourcing. So instead of it having like one solid whitish yellow value or white value, now it has basically like a dark red, a darker whitish yellow. And so the intensity of the color is not as great as it once was. So we may have to bump the exposure on the light to compensate for that. So that'll just be my final thing, is I'm going to select the light source and be like, well, I like the coloration, but it's a little bit too dark. It's skewing a little bit more like sundown right now rather than daylight. So to fix that, all I'm going to do is come in here to the exposure value, and I'm going to crank that up to 7. And then we'll see how that looks. I'll give it some time to render. There we go. And now it's skewing more daylight rather than sundown. I probably have too much red in my ground layer. So I would go in. At this point, the next phase would be to go in and get the value back to good, back to what I wanted. And then now I would go back and tweak all the colors again. But this is a good stopping point. This is kind of your initial daylight setup. If I want to increase the quality here now on the render, what I would do is be like, okay, I really like this. Now I would go into the view settings and change the resolution. If I was doing this for homework, I'd change it to 100%. And then I would let that render. Be prepared for the renders to take about 10 or 15 minutes, something like that, depending on how fast your computer is. My machine's pretty fast, so like I think these would render in like maybe a minute and a half or something like that. But again, this is dependent on the machine speed. So that's basically it. If you don't like the noise, then you have to come in here and change these values. But again, you're going to really kill your render times. So I'd probably experiment with maybe doing like a 6 here and 5s and see how that goes. And you can see here my render time really went through the roof because I rendered at 100%, but by the time this thing is done, it's going to look a lot better. But I'm not going to sit here and wait for it to render. I'm going to go ahead and stop the video, and then we'll pick up at the next phase.